The thing I'm going to be covering in this stream is the isidewith.com political quiz and kind of how it's a good vehicle for talking about my personal politics and my attitudes towards religion and politics and, you know, different economic systems, yada yada. There's not really a single word or phrase that describes my politics. I've changed what my the description of my personal politics are. You know, over the years, I started out way back as a conservative. Um, I think that changed around 2000. I mean, I don't think I was ever fully a conservative, but you know, I grew up. I grew up like, you know, total evangelical Christian, conservative person, and was just kind of taking my cues from talk radio and stuff. Probably about like, I don't know, 2013 or earlier. Like I started getting more like uh, less minarchist or minimal government, and more towards the libertarian side of things. Um, and you know, as I've tried to find a word that describes my politics, um, better keep Twitch up just so I can monitor my own channel. Really, I don't have time for this. I'm already streaming. Um, you know, I think I went from being anarcho-capitalist to you know, I've tried voluntarianist, Rothbardian, anarcho-egoist, um, you know, but the problem is that every time I've tried to use one of those terms and I've joined a group, I've found that those people who profess that stuff, you know, who claim they um, go with those views, end up not being consistent in what the definition supposedly is. Um, you know, it's like, okay, you're saying that you're a voluntarianist. Well, here's something that contradicts that and shows that you're not as voluntarianist as you claim to be, or you're not as agorist as you claim to be. So it's not necessarily even that the terms are inaccurate or that the philosophies behind those terms are bad. Um, as much as it is the people who are in those communities are inconsistent, and a lot of times end up just kind of derailing what the what that political affiliation is supposed to be. Um, so it's like, okay, I guess I've got to make my own from scratch. You know, I've found stuff that's closer to being a consistent and ethical political system, um, you know, as you can get. But then it ends up getting corrupted by people who say that they're a part of that. Um, or you know, you look at the writings of the people who came up with those terms, and they end up not being consistent with those terms. Um, and I'm trying to speak only in the most general, broad sense, because you know, if you get down into the particulars, it might come down to like a single issue, or like even a single case in history where the adherents of those beliefs end up just kind of cherry picking what parts of that belief they're going to go with. So I'm kind of left with only being able to define things on my own terms. And that doesn't mean I'm, a sovereign citizen or anarcho-individualist. What that means is that just people haven't done a good enough job describing something that's consistent and ethical. Something that can apply to all cases. I've thought about this and donut steel, but anarcho-situationalist might be a good term for me to use, but I'm hesitant to even put that out there because maybe there's somebody who's already come up with that term and they're already misusing it, and they've already got views that are on the wrong side of the tracks and stuff. I wonder if I can pause a stream. Nope. I guess I could try to share this on Facebook. I don't want to spend time. I guess I can spend as much time as I want, like just goofing off in this stream, because right now nobody's watching it. So what is the thing that could probably most closely describe what I believe without trying to use a single term? I've put out there anarcho-situationalist, and it could even be something that's as particular to me as an individual out of 8 billion people. It's anarcho-joeyism, where the most accurate way to describe what I believe is just to describe me. It's like the politics of Joey are the politics of Joey, and it's like, all right, Marxism is a thing. It's named after a guy. Um, why should I not be able to have my own little set of politics named after myself? Um, so yeah, I guess the thing that separates my politics from other people's is uh, I believe that coercion is wrong, and that applies to the non-aggression principle. But the non-aggression principle has its limits in that it doesn't necessarily account for preemptive action, and I'm in favor of that. Uh, there could be a case where someone is pointing a gun at you but has not fired yet. Um, you should not have to wait until that person pulls the trigger in order to act. Um, that person poses a threat to you, just I'm talking in the hypothetical, and I'm trying to see if I can get you on board with um, just the idea rather than the particular of an analogy. Um, in just the most simple terms, uh, someone points a gun at you, they haven't fired yet, you go ahead and initiate force by firing on them. It could also apply to terroristic threatening. Somebody says, I will shoot you. That should also be a case for self defense. Now, obviously, that doesn't account for stuff like restraining orders or hiring a bodyguard or wearing a bulletproof vest or something like that. The point is, preemptive action is justified in some, but not all cases. Um, I think that coercion applies to the state and to religion. Uh, and when I'm talking about the state, I'm stating in essence that a state is a force of coercion. Um, something that can act against you without your permission, um, in violation of pre-agreed upon terms. Um, if you voluntarily enter into an agreement and someone decides to breach that agreement, um, you have a case in your defense for some kind of a remedy. So if a government is saying, we as a democratic society have decided 99 to 1 that we're going to take your organs and give them to somebody else, that's a use of coercion, and it goes against whatever social contract that's you've explicitly agreed to, and steps outside of the bounds of that contract. um, I also think that there's something that purely individualistic people tend to gloss over, which is um, that there are cases where you have done something wrong, and it means that a majority of people will have to act against you, um, to come up with a solution to that problem. So let's say you're a terrorist, and within the society you're the one who's violated um, the terms of an agreement, or you've terroristically threatened other people. um, in that case, there's a justification for um, arresting you or compelling you to um, provide remuneration or restoration to the parties that you've injured. Um, there's cases where there are limits to what you can do against other people. Um, you there are clear cases where if you act in a certain way, yes, you're exercising your own um, freedom to do something, but you're infringing on the freedoms of other people. Um, and there's cases where if you walk around, let's say you're aware that you have HIV, and you go into a public space where there's a reasonable expectation of safety, um, and knowingly, like, you cut yourself and you bleed into the pool. We've exposed other people to a danger either through negligence or through deliberate malice. Uh, you don't have the right to do that. You don't have the freedom to do that. Um, there's just because you can do something uh, doesn't mean you ought to do it, and it doesn't mean you ought to be safe from prosecution for that act. Um, I'm trying to stay on the major issues without saying, okay, this issue that I'm talking about is um, not just a side thing, um, but is key or a central component of what I believe. Um, I think when there's a case that something needs to happen, uh, it doesn't necessarily matter who is accomplishing that goal, just as long as the goal is accomplished. And that's different from saying the means justify the ends or the ends justify the means. Um, what I'm saying is, like, say there's a fire, like, I don't know, a hospital's on fire. I don't care who's putting out the fire. The fire needs to be put out. Um, we can figure out later whether it's right or wrong for an evil person to put out the fire versus a good person to put out the fire, and what we're going to do with those people after the fact. The point is, right now, there's a fire and it needs to be taken care of. So yeah, I think that's the central issues. It's just the NAP, preemptive action, uh, dangers to um, more than one person, uh, dangers to any one person other than the person that's committing the act. Um, you know, uh, the primacy of getting a problem fixed versus who's doing the fixing, not necessarily the ends justifying the means. Um, I think those are two different issues. Um, so yeah, there's just not one single issue that encompasses all those things, because if you've got one, you can't have the other. In some political philosophies, so it's like, all right, I'm just gonna have to play it by ear here and go on an issue by issue basis. Nobody is talking. I'm just here by myself. I am recording this so I can upload this to YouTube. So with those ideas in mind, hopefully this makes sense and I can get started on this quiz. The last time I filled out this quiz was back in probably 2014, 15, or 16. I have not voted since 2014 because inconsistency with my own politics, voting is a coercive act in that it is establishing a state that will then forcibly act against the interests of people who have not chosen to be a part of that state. It's like, all right, participation in the state ought to be voluntary, and if it's something that forwards the goal of legitimizing the state, I don't think it's right to be a part of it. Although that's closer to what I believed back in 2016 than what I believe now. Now I'm more pragmatic. Now I'm just like, if it accomplishes a goal, you know, use a means even though it's ultimately criminal to vote to accomplish that goal. You know, we can sort out after the fact, go back to prosecuting people for the act of participating in the state after the problem of the state has been taken care of and that it's gone out of existence. So what I'm going to do as I go through this, I'm going to talk about where my views were back in, you know, 2014, 15, 16. Because I don't remember, this site doesn't log when you last completed the quiz. So I'm just, you know, using that as a guess. And I'm going to compare and contrast that to what I now think is the case. So that has been a lot of pre-ramble for what I'm gonna now do, which is go through these who knows how many questions and talk about each one of them. Should the government subsidize farmers? All right, so when I first answered this, or when I last answered this, it's based on saying the government should not be involved in any issues at all, ever. There should be no government. It should just be you and me and anybody else who's affected by it. You know, if you don't have skin in the game, then butt out. So it's the laissez-faire capitalism kind of thing. Today, which is a little bit different, but still pretty much the same. The problem with government subsidies to farmers is that they are mostly awarded to big businesses who don't even need those subsidies. And without those government subsidies, you know, we would have smaller businesses and more competition, you know, in the farming industry. You know, it's it's already corrupt. So just on that basis, you could say, no, we ought not to subsidize farmers. But, you know, you could make the case that well, all that needs to happen is the government needs to get its act together, stop being corrupt, and actually reform the subsidy system. You know, there's really no good argument to subsidizing farming. You know, it's like, all right, we are never not going to have food, have a demand for food. You know, there's the problem of being dependent on other countries for our food supply, you know, because who knows, the other country might be corrupt. It might be a dictatorship or something like that, and you don't want to depend on them. And so, you know, they go, oh, obviously we have to subsidize our farmers so that our food source can be monopolized and you know, the protectionist stance towards a business. So I don't know that letting, let me see what the other stances are. Small local farms. Well, something can be local and not small, and something can be small and not local. Yeah, there's no way I'm gonna read all these. Oh, it erased my thingy. Nuts. Here, let me just refresh this and see if it'll repopulate. What happened to my thingy? It was just there. No, this is not something that was. I don't think this was my stance. I think this was just like one of the options that was there. All right, let's just start from the stop. Start from the start instead of jumping into the middle. Should the U.S. Continue to support Israel? No, we should not give aid to any foreign nations. If we're, oops, you know, this kind of goes into the same category. I'm just going to be doing most or least on these. I'm not going to bother in the middle. It goes into the same category of subsidies, but it's even worse. It's even worse here because it's not something that's within your country that you can control, and it's going to an outside source. And that sounds isolationist, but it more has to do with what you have the ability to control versus what you don't. Like, you don't know where that money is going. And you have no control over how it's spent or what the other country does with it or the other entity. I'm especially careful with giving money to charities and stuff. It's got to be a charity that's you know, open and transparent, and you can track its funding, and they're doing ethical things with it, and they're all things that they've said they're going to do. And most of the time, I mean, I really don't even give money to charities. I give money to individuals because I know exactly what they need and what they're going to do with it. So yeah, it's I don't know why they would I mean, I think maybe they're picking Israel because we give more money to Israel than any other country, but that applies to just any country. It's like we don't give money. We give money to China, just not in the same way. Not in terms of a charity thing. And this has to do with support, like military support too. Well, I don't think military support is really any different from something like giving money to a starving country or something like that. You're not even giving money to the starving people, you're giving it to the country to decide what to do with. So yeah, and I'll talk about later, but I don't think there should be a military at all. I think that should be up to people on an individual level, and you shouldn't be compelled to give money to a military that really is kind of just not beholden to your interests and is doing whatever they want. Maybe there's some nudging from politicians and stuff, but it's like you're mostly defining your own mission. Should the U.S. remain in the United Nations? We don't have to remove the headquarters. I don't know. Blobity, blobity, blobity. I mean, you can keep the stinking building and have your meetings here. It's just we ought not to be contributing to an organization that is able to be defined by, again, other institutions which are out of our control. You've got, I don't know, let's just say like Afghanistan, where they have to go through a third party before they go to the US. The US has to report to the people instead of just going, all right, when I want to talk to Afghanistan, I'm going to do it as an individual. I'll just say no, because you don't need to remove the headquarters. Just, you got your hotels nearby and everything. Should foreign terrorism suspects be given constitutional rights? I mean, the problem with adding my own stance is that it doesn't get factored into whatever result you get at the end. It'll just register as, other. So, this is my response. And when I'm talking about the Constitution, I'm talking about the U.S. Constitution. I don't know if there's such a thing as a local constitution. So the problem with the Constitution is that you have no input on it. I wasn't there in 1792. What was the Constitution written? 1789. I wasn't there in 1789. I have next to no control over what happens to it now. I didn't sign on to the Constitution. I didn't consent to it. When people talk about a social contract, the presumption there is that you're grandfathered into it, and it applies to you automatically without your consent. I don't think that's right. You know, we ought to have things that are on a opt-in contractual basis. Every time you read it in EULA, you're agreeing to it at the end of it. You know, and those are voluntary things. If you don't agree to it, you don't get to participate in that product or service. You know, all those things are based in consent. When you're talking about the rules of a locality, you know, or a country, you don't have any say in that. If you go to another place, you have a choice prior to entering into that place to either abide by those rules, you know, whether you're becoming a citizen or you're just there as a tourist. You know, you have a choice to say, yep, I agree to those rules, I'm going to live there, or visit. Whereas if you are born into a country who are, assuming your parents are citizens of that country, you are grandfathered into it. So, you know, you get birthright protections from the Constitution. Problem is that child hasn't consented to the Constitution, and neither has anybody else that was born after 1789 or even before then, where you had you know, politicians that were speaking on behalf of people. Okay, so let's say you've got a majority, 51% vote for you know, I don't know, Washington, and 49% vote for John Smith. Well, those 49% haven't consented to whatever decisions that Washington has made. And they ought not to be compelled to abide by those rules. So I could answer this with just a flat no, or saying the more nuanced answer, or I could add my own stance. I don't know. I'm mostly doing this to define my own politics. So it would be more accurate just to have my own stance in there. So, I mean, this is a long way of saying, um, this option, they're not US citizens, they don't have constitutional rights. However, I reject the premise that there are such a thing as constitutional rights, um, and that like any rights are either there's human rights and then there's constitutional rights. Well, constitutions vary by country, um, and there's probably constitutions where uh, they grant certain human rights to people uh, that are not part of that country, and those are thus constitutional and human rights. In the particular case of the US, the Constitution doesn't cover anyone. Well, the US Constitution doesn't, in this particular case of foreign terrorism, um, it specifically addresses people who are acting outside the auspices of a government, um, and are not party to a state military. There's other agreements in the UN, the Geneva Convention, um, that cover enemy combatants, but those only apply to people who are within governments. People who are lone wolves, just radicalized in another country, or um, people who are acting of their own accord and are not U.S. citizens, are not afforded constitutional rights. So this is asking not what is the current status of foreign terrorism suspects, but what ought to happen, uh, which is a different question. If you ask what the legal opinion is, it's going to say one thing, but if you're asking for a philosophical, normative thing, that's a lot tougher of a question, and I have to think about that. My main problem is the assumption of constitutional rights as a thing, but this question is more geared towards, you know, should someone who doesn't currently have legal rights be given legal rights? Um, so you're talking about suspects. You're not even talking about people who've been convicted of terrorism. So you've got to have some way of dealing with people that you capture who's a suspect. And the fact that they're foreign does make a difference, because they're saying, I don't care what your rules are, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. And you've got domestic terrorists, but you've got foreign terrorists. So this is talking about the foreign case. I think if when we break stuff down to an individual level, you would get less of this, because then it's more of a matter of, we got a court, we got a criminal suspect. What do we do with this? It at that point, does it really stinking matter whether somebody's from Afghanistan or whether they're from Atlanta? If they've committed a terrorism, or suspected of committing terrorism, ought they to be afforded the other protections that people who are not suspect to an act ought to be afforded? It's like, when you become a suspect, that's different from when you're convicted of an act. When you're convicted of an act, you're waiving rights. If you've been found guilty of a crime, convicted and sentenced, you have, by committing that original act, you've waived your rights. You have said, I don't care about the rules, I'm going to do whatever I want. I saw someone who, I don't know, made me mad, so I killed him. You have waived your right to be outside of a jail cell, because we know you're a threat and you could kill again. It's like, we're just doing whatever we have to in order to make it so that this doesn't happen again. I guess you could look at actual cases versus theoretical cases, of foreign suspects, terrorism suspects. It's like, when you're processing someone through a system to try to figure out their guilt and what you're going to do with them, you got to have some kind of a systematic process. But this really isn't even asking about due process or court cases, and I feel like this is kind of smuggling in some stuff that's not really relevant. Because what you're dealing with in this question is just, should someone who's a foreign terrorism suspect be given constitutional rights? So what that means is, you've got someone who's a foreign terrorism suspect. So regardless of whether or not they've committed terrorism, they're still a foreign suspect, who is not afforded the same constitutional rights as other people. You know, if you've got a green card or something, I don't know what the deal is with the rights you don't have, or whether you're just a tourist. I don't know if you have the same constitutional rights. This is a tough question. Sheesh. So yeah, I mean, this question is asking, or this answer is saying, you know, they should be treated no differently than American citizens. Um, I think what you're talking about is a normative versus a prescriptive thing. Um, you know, there's a difference between what is and what ought to be. I mean, the whole point of, in this context, because it's got the um, suspects part in it, it's already suggesting that there's going to be a trial, and you've got to figure out, you know, whether that person is guilty or not, of committing a crime. I think after they've been convicted of a crime by whatever organization is responsible for, or court is responsible for determining the innocence or guilt of a suspect, after that person's been convicted, okay, now you've got a case where you can say this person is no longer a foreign terrorism suspect, but is a foreign terrorism convict. If that's the case, you know, they have waived their constitutional rights, or I don't know if it even has to do with constitutional rights. They have waived their human rights. But, you know, as for a suspect, it's like, what are you doing depriving someone of the constitutional rights afforded to foreigners being everyone who's a foreigner? What are you doing depriving that person versus anybody else who's a terrorism suspect? You know, you got plenty of foreigners who are not terrorism suspects, but they, I'm assuming, maybe have some constitutional rights. So I guess this is something that I'd have to look up more. Like, what rights do foreigners have, period? You know, you'd have to break that down to people who have green cards, people who have foreign travel visas, or tourist visas, people who have, let's see, I think those are the only two things that let you get into a country, but I could be wrong. So yeah, I mean this is an old issue. This is going back to when Gitmo started out, uh, or even back to early in the Bush era in 2003 when the Iraq War was starting, or even before then, around 2001 where you had 9/11 suspects. Um, and it was a situation where you had people who were being detained for years without any kind of a trial at all. Um, so this is kind of saying that this is tying Guantanamo Bay to fair trials. Well, I mean, you need a trial. This is kind of suggesting that there's not going to be a fair trial if it's a military tribunal. Well, a military tribunal is for people who are enemy combatants. Um, people who are enemy combatants registered in a foreign military. When you're talking about foreign terrorism suspects, they're acting as lone wolves and not at the behest of a foreign military. So I think what you really need is a new court set up, um, that's specifically for these kinds of situations. But the thing is, I don't know if the Constitution even covers those things. Um, it's like this kind of was a non-issue back in 1789, um, because you had people that were in uniform, uh, fighting for one country or another, or if you captured someone, you knew who they were fighting for. They were fighting on behalf of a nation. Um, there's been situations in the Revolutionary War where people didn't wear uniforms, um, or during the Civil War where you just had, if somebody was, stuff wasn't clean cut, you had people that weren't wearing uniforms, they were just wearing whatever street clothes they had and acting, in guerrilla, uh, units, just cells. It's like people assume, they just automatically assume that people back in 1789 had it all right, and there's no improvement that you can make on it. But the thing is, they were trying to do their best in a complicated situation. We're doing stuff from scratch. It's like, look, for as smart as they were, they had their limits. You don't have 2020 foresight, and people just automatically grant that to the founders, or you could say that about any constitution. And I think the originalist, uh, people like just don't want to recognize that they could have gotten something wrong. All right, so I'm done answering that question. What would be the proper language for that? After guilty verdict is proclaimed, announced. This is kind of being redundant, but I'm just going to say guilty verdict is pronounced. Debrided? Removed? I don't know what the right word would be. Seized? Cancelled? Bereft? Should the military fly drones over foreign countries to gain intelligence and kill suspected terrorists? That's kind of a loaded word there. We can't declare war on someone who's a terrorism suspect because they're not a member of a foreign military. The problem is that there ought not to be a military. Well, here's the thing. They haven't... Nobody who's a terrorism suspect ought to be killed, right? You've got to convict the person before you can kill them. I'm getting too tired for this. I should have gone to bed like an hour or 40 minutes ago. You can't just kill someone that you suspect is a villain and then go after the fact, oh, you know what, that person that was a suspect, well, they were actually innocent. Oops. Should the U.S. continue? I need to stop doing this. Should the There's like hundreds of questions I can't answer. I shouldn't even be up doing this right now. Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to end the stream here because I've got to go to bed. This is gonna take a while to get through. Hopefully pick it up tomorrow.